Hey, good evening, everyone. During my first year of seminary, I was asked to develop a regular spiritual practice. It was supposed to take about an hour every week, and I was expected to report out about it periodically to my fellow students and professors. And before this time, I had never really had a spiritual practice of any kind. But good student that I was very excited to dive in and go really deep. Here's what I decided to do, and this is exactly what I wrote and turned in. I have chosen to do what I will call a morning meditation. This will mean I will wake up at dawn every morning, light 3 candles, and do 3 things. 1, I will write 2 pages longhand in my journal before I'm fully awake. 2, I will choose a reading to copy into my journal and turn over in my mind. And 3, I will sit in centering meditation for 5 to 10 minutes before extinguishing the flame. I plan to do this every day. And I expect the practice to take about 30 minutes. Now, keeping in mind that I was taking a full graduate load of classes, doing an internship at a social services agency, and was pregnant with my very first child. Guess how many times I engaged in this particular spiritual practice? It was 1 time, the morning I thought it up, and literally never again. It was such a lovely idea, and I wanted to be the kind of person who wakes up at dawn and writes and contemplates and sits in silence. But the reality of my life at that particular moment was pretty different. And I think for many of us, spiritual practice kind of just feels like one more thing we should be doing, like cooking balanced meals and going to the gym. And maybe we don't really know where to begin, especially if we're not religious in a super traditional way. So I was raised Unitarian Universalist in the 80s and 90s in a household full of academics. I was taught to be skeptical about anything that felt too spiritual. And I remember asking my dad one time, I was like, "Do you think you believe in God?" And he said, "If there were a God, it would likely be so complex that us trying to understand it would be like an ant trying to understand a computer." And this certainly is one way to look at agnosticism, as a deep and almost dismissive ambivalence about the existence of God. But in my experience, I have grown and connected with many, many agnostic people as an adult. I think it is often more true to say that agnostics are deeply committed to embracing uncertainty, humility, and change. Maybe God is too complex for us to understand, and in light of that, we actively center mystery and questioning instead of certainty and answers. We think of our relationship with spirituality as the practice of remaining open to revelation. And so then the question becomes, how do we practice being uncertain in a way that feels meaningful and life-affirming? Perhaps because of my upbringing, I had always thought of a spiritual practice as a somber, solitary endeavor, a time where you and mystery intermingle alone and size each other up. But my attempts to sit calmly and copy down eloquent words felt like a chore, not a joy. Perhaps for some people who spend their days amidst rush and noise, this practice would feel like a beautiful place for rest and restoration. But my program at the time meant I already spent a good deal of my time reading in silent, solitary contemplation. So I owned up to my lack of spiritual practice during a weekly check-in with a small group of my classmates. And I got a piece of advice that changed how I oriented myself to the idea of a spiritual practice. One of my colleagues who knew me really well said, "Alex, you have more spiritual practices than anyone I know." And I was like, "What?" She said, "You draw, you take a daily bath, you play music, you make time for your friends. These are all spiritual practices if you do them with intention. So just follow your joy and stop trying so hard." And if that isn't one of the perpetual life lessons that I refuse to learn, I don't know what is. Follow your joy and just stop trying so hard. But of course, she was totally right. I do have a tendency to believe that everything should be hard, and that if something comes easily, it must not be of much value. A spiritual practice of any kind is designed to help you reorient to the energy and the life around you, to lift you out of the ordinary and automatic responses that we have to things. It's a way of just reminding ourselves of who we are and what our values are with intention. But you know what? They don't have to be hard. What I have learned over the last 10 years is that the very best spiritual practice that you can do is the one that you will do. It's the one you're probably already doing. So the question I bring to you today, to this room full of people who I know to be deeply spiritual and committed to living into the mystery, isn't what is a spiritual practice for agnostics, but rather knowing you should be engaging in a spiritual practice. Are you doing it? Are you taking the time every day to connect with the spiritual part of yourself? Are you listening to your inner voice? Are you finding spaces where you feel at home with your mind and with your body and with your soul? A spiritual practice needs to be something you can manage even when you are at your lowest capacity, when the world has become bleak or overwhelming or exhausting. For me, that's walks in the woods, and if I can't manage that, and sometimes I really can't, I take my shoes off and walk barefoot in my yard. It's a hot bath with a cup of tea. It's a guided meditation at bedtime. It's putting on a playlist of songs from the early 90s and going for a drive at night. It's finding the moon between the houses. It's the extra 5 minutes I sit in my car before I come into the house. It is the desperate prayers I write into my notes app. Instead of being something you need to add to your daily routine, I invite you to think of spiritual practice as places of intentional respite. These things may be the very things you are doing when you think you're avoiding your spiritual practice. What are you doing when you're avoiding other things? Do that, but with intention. What I have learned over many, many years of working with people as a spiritual director, which is a career that involves meeting with people one-on-one, talking about life, talking about meaning, and constantly berating them about their spiritual practices, is that if you are going to have spirit in your life, it needs to be intimate, messy, and personal. It's not going to look like high church. It's not going to look good from the outside, but hopefully sometimes it will feel good on the inside. And what's fascinating to notice for me is 10 years after I concocted the original spiritual practice plan, I do find myself waking up at dawn and writing longhand before I am fully awake and sitting in silence for long stretches of time. As I wrote this for you, I was watching a neon pink and blue morning stretch across my office window as I drank my French roast coffee. But it took me a really long time to carve out that kind of time for myself. And there are seasons in our lives that call for a complete overhaul of the way we've been practicing our spiritual practices. It's quite possible that your soul is needing desperately to connect. There are communal spiritual practices. Coming to church is perhaps the most popular of all spiritual practices, and look at us doing it right now. Woo! There are other communal practices, though, right? There's drumming circles, there's volunteer work, there's camping and hiking, there's playing with children, there's board games and yoga and wisdom circles. The list goes on and on. The point is, a practice is designed to be done in repetition. So make sure you're choosing practices that you actually enjoy and things that you want to get better at. More importantly, it's probably not going to be very cinematic if you're doing a really honest practice. It's probably going to be pretty boring from the outside, and maybe even a little embarrassing to imagine someone else watching or grading in paper form. A spiritual practice at its core is a time in which you might have a spiritual experience. And for anyone, but especially for those of us who intentionally and courageously center mystery at the heart of our lives, it is a time to grapple with unanswerable questions, a time to receive solace from the ever-present hum of existence, and for a moment or two, be held in that ineffable, radiant love of which we are all part. Not just in theory, but in practice. When an explosion explodes hard enough, dust wakes up and thinks about itself. We are miraculous, mysterious, breathing, singing, meaning-making creatures of this earth. Don't forget to listen to each other, listen to your inner voice, and practice joy and awe as often as you can.